Yeah. Right. Like Catherine, I didn't really know how to pitch this, so I've gone in quite kind of low. I'm going to begin, before I talk about what I'm going to be talking to you today, I'll begin with a demonstration. And I'm going to show you a pair of pictures that are switching back and forth. And they're probably at first will seem like they're identical, but in actual fact there's a change that's occurring between the two pictures. So what I'd just like you to do is, when you spot what's changing, just stick your finger in the air. Some people, some more of you. Still none of it, yeah?
It's one way to get
That's not supposed to happen. Right, so which is the pointer, which is the laser? Sits there. That quite large building is appearing and disappearing. Okay, so in psychology we call that change blindness, and that's the finding that people are quite poor at spotting sometimes quite large changes in their visual environment. And what that tells us is that our attentional capacity is quite limited. We're unable to pay attention to the whole of a scene and fully comprehend all the details that go on in that scene. Okay. But that wasn't why I showed you that image. I'd like you just to think now about how aware you were of your own eye movements while you were searching for that image. Would you say that you've got a really good memory of where you looked and when you looked and how long you looked? You're nodding. Well, generally people are quite poor at remembering and reporting the fine details of their own eye movements. In fact, I've got a slightly racy anecdote that is testament to this, which is another university where I used to work, we used to conduct a lot of eye tracking and driving research, and one of my colleagues was out in the car doing some of this research with a male participant driving, and she was a female. And when she got back to the lab and she was analysing where he was looking, whenever they were at some traffic lights and they were paused, he wasn't looking at her face. She didn't realise that until she was analysing the data. So I think that's a kind of good testament to the fact that we're not usually genuinely aware of our eye movements. And the reason for that is that we have quite limited mental capacity, quite limited attentional capacity. And if we used up some of that by concentrating on where we were looking, it would reduce the amount that we had to deal with the task at hand. So most of the eye movements we make, we do unconsciously, and as a result we find it difficult to report them. So, what I'm going to talk to you about today, a bit like Catherine's talk, comes in two parts. So I'm first of all going to talk about media psychology, which is a programme that I teach along with my colleague Sharon Cohen at Salford University. And I'm then going to talk, hopefully with a seamless segue, about eye tracking as a methodology that we use in media psychology and that can be used in UX as well. My background is actually in eye tracking, so I've worked as a psychology researcher since I graduated in 1998, and most of that research has involved eye tracking, and I've done eye tracking work with older adults, with people with Parkinson's disease, with people using prosthetic limbs, and I'll show you some of that data in a bit later in this talk, and with preschool children, and with loads and loads and loads of psychology undergraduates. And one of the projects I was involved with when I moved to Salford was a project with CBeebies, looking at web usability in preschool children. And from that project I began to be very interested in the psychology of media, and had a look around, and there were no other master's programmes at that point in media psychology. So we started the UK's first and still only master's programme in media psychology. So I'm going to talk to you a bit about what's involved in media psychology first, and then more about eye tracking. So media psychology is quite broad, and it's quite difficult to offer you a concise definition of what media psychology is. But essentially, we study any kind of mediated experience, and that includes our experiences with television, which is the one that's probably received the most research interest, but also internet, gaming, internet and gaming, and the various facets of our mediated experience that we study in media psychology. We will look at why people come to make certain choices to undertake certain media activities. So that could be related to their personality or related to their particular state or some demographic factors. The social context and societal and cultural factors that determine people's experiences. And then this one, probably the most overlap with UX, is their engagement with different media experiences and what those experiences are like. And then also the effects. So those effects could be immediate or short-term, such as a kind of change in arousal, or they could be long-term, such that our media experiences might change the way that we actually perceive the world. Okay. So, as more of our mediated experiences have been moving online, there's an increased focus in media psychology to study our technology use. So we're kind of having more and more overlap with HCI as a discipline. And the perspective that we take in media psychology is to a lifespan perspective, with the idea that we need to understand how human beings change across the lifespan to understand their technology use. So understand how children develop their capacity, their cognitive capacity to understand the world, but then also how those cognitive capacity might start to diminish in older adulthood. So a slightly depressing fact is that a lot of our cognitive abilities start to decline from our mid-20s onwards. So I don't know about any of you guys, but mine are on downhill slope. So a slightly depressing fact. But some things like our vocabulary continue to get better throughout our lifespan, so not all bad. But one factor that's important is the fact that our brains have what we call plasticity, which is that they're able to mould and change in relation to their experience. So the environment and repeated experiences that we engage in our environment will shape our brains in terms of strengthening connections and growing new neurons. So there's some research that I just came across actually on my way here that's reported in Wired magazine, that people who engage in a lot of gaming activity have thicker brain structures in parts of their brain that are related to problem solving and also related to attention. So the idea is that those repeated experiences are actually shaping their brains to become more efficient at dealing with those particular stimuli. And then if we relate that to the fact that our technological environments are changing through history and across different societies, then there's the idea that the technology that we have in our society actually changes the way we are, changes who we are, shapes our brains. So this is the idea that we're shaped by the tools. So there's a famous quote that we create our tools and then our tools thereafter create us. Or we shape our tools and our tools shape us. It's often attributed to this guy, Marshall McLuhan, but actually it's not his quote. But he's the main person that's associated with this idea that the technology that we create has a profound effect on us as human beings. In actual fact, the idea can be traced back to Socrates in about the 5th century BC, because he was worried that as writing became more popular, people would lose the ability to actually remember stuff, because they would offload all the information onto the page and it would weaken their brains. So this is an early example of the idea that if you don't use it, you lose it. Okay, so seeing the brain as like a muscle in the body. If you don't exercise certain processes, then they weaken. And then this idea is getting lots of interest now with the internet, with writers such as Nicholas Carr, who wrote a book about this called The Shallows, which is the idea that the way information is presented in the internet encourages us to read things in a shallow way, follow hyperlinks, skip over stuff, get distracted by emails and texts and stuff. And so all this kind of interruption and this shallow reading is making us really distractible, lowering our attention spans, etc. And actually there's some evidence that this might be happening. So people who multitask a lot with multiple media devices seem to perform worse in activities that require blocking out distraction. so they're more destructible. And then this is me starting my segue into the eye tracking stuff. This is some data from one of our undergraduate students who conducted an eye tracking study in this area. So what he was interested in is how people read information when they don't think they're going to have another chance to check the details, compared with how people read information when they think they're going to be able to use their phone to check that information later on. So these two bits of data show what we call scan paths, where the circles correspond to where the eye is still and taking in information from the image, and the lines between the circles correspond to the movements of the eyes between those fixations when the eye is still. I'll explain a bit more about this later, but all you need to really see here is that when you think that you're not going to have another chance to learn this information, you spend a lot of time staring at it, and you read the page very carefully. There's lots of fixations here, and some of them are quite long. Versus when you think you can just go back and check on this information, you skim over it. You don't spend a lot of time dwelling on it. So the implication of this, even if that sounds sort of fairly obvious and intuitive, the implication of this is, if we carry around devices which we see as being like external memories, where we don't have to kind of remember lots of stuff, is that we don't exercise those processes that are involved in actually learning. So we might be losing the ability to learn and store information. Okay. Then the area that I think's got the most overlap with UX is when we look at engagement. And when we talk about engagement, we can identify kind of different levels of how we engage with things, how we engage with our media experiences. So the very kind of lowest level, we might just be in the presence of something. So the TV might be on and we might be in the same room, but we're not giving it any of our attention at all. Then at the next level, we could be paying attention to it. We could be following a narrative, or we could be interested to some extent in a story, but we're just paying attention to it. We're not really that engaged, and anything else would come along and compete for our attention and kind of snap us out of it. Then the next level is the most interesting, I think, psychologically, and that's when we become really immersed in something, really, really absorbed and really engaged. And we call that different things in different contexts. So if it's a story we're following, a narrative, we call that transportation, because it's like we're being transported into the world of that narrative. If it's an activity, like gaming or perhaps browsing through web pages, we call that flow. So when we're really, really interested in something, and there seems to be certain conditions which will instill this kind of feeling of flow, and that's if something's quite challenging, but we also feel we've got a sense of mastery over it. Okay? So we feel we can do it, but it also it's kind of at the peak of what we're able to do. And we call that flow. I have an example. And this is an example from Series 3 Game of Thrones. I don't think it really gives too much away, so but maybe I should do a spoiler alert.
It's all gives everything away.
Do you know what this is relating to?
Yeah.
These are my favourite. Look at those two guys in the police. So I'll leave it at that now. And pause it. Right, I'm going to leave that playing because I can't seem to work it out. Right, thank you. Okay, so I find that kind of quite interesting, really, that something that rationally you know isn't real, that's taking place in the kind of small box in the corner of your room, can cause such extreme emotional reactions. And so what's interesting is the psychological conditions whereby that's made possible. So you have to basically suspend your disbelief. You have to accept the world of the narrative. So you have to kind of remove yourself from the world that you exist in, and you have to understand the world that's going on the TV screen. And psychological studies of this kind of state show that people lose self-consciousness, so they stop kind of feeling like they're in their own body, and they lose consciousness of time, they lose awareness of time. And when you ask people afterwards to reflect on what that experience was like, they can tell you in a very kind of high-level way, like, well, I found that really, really amazing, or I found that really, really engaging or really scary. But they can't tell you too much about how they were feeling during that experience because they're fully absorbed with whatever it is that they're watching or doing. And then finally, a level of engagement is when we're self-reflecting on something and self-reflecting on what that experience means for us. So it could be watching the Red Wedding, like those two kind of still dudes were on the sofa at the end there. They might be thinking, what am I getting out of this? So they're back in their own bodies and they're self-reflecting on what that experience that they're watching means to them. So they're not absorbed, they're not transported into the world, they're back and they're thinking about themselves. Okay, so this is where I'm now starting to be interested in eye tracking. Right now, this table might require a little bit of explanation. So there's various ways that we can measure people's experiences. We can either do the measuring during that experience, or we can do the measure after that experience retrospectively. The trouble is with some measures is that if you do them during, they don't really lend themselves to you being able to understand what an experience is like for somebody if they're fully absorbed and they're not self-conscious. And some measures, such as, for instance, think aloud, if you get people to think aloud during an activity, then by their very nature, because you're asking them to reflect on it, they're never going to be able to be transported. They're never going to be able to lose that self-consciousness. So one thing that really appeals to me about eye tracking is that if done right, if you do eye tracking well, then you should be able to, the participants should be able to forget they're being eye tracked, and they should be able to get more immersed in their experience. If you ask them to think aloud during that experience, you're going to snap them back. They're necessarily going to be in a reflective state. So what this table shows, I should have explained, is the green shows what will work. So physiological recording and observation will work during an activity. Focus group interview and scales and questionnaires won't work well actually during an activity. You tend to do them retrospectively. The yellow shows that they may be able to indicate some information about this absorbed state, but it won't be a very good reflection. Eye tracking, I think, you can do through any of these states of engagement during, and then retrospective think aloud, whereby you ask people to look at their scan paths afterwards, can be done afterwards, and will give you some good information about people's level of engagement. Okay. And then the various different aspects of things we might want to measure, which is the final part of this table, is we can measure people's emotional responses, their behaviour, their cognitive responses, or their attention. So the methods here correspond to which sort of aspects of the experience we might be measuring. And eye tracking really measures attention and perhaps cognitive performance as well. Okay. Are you with me on this bit?
Yes.
Good. Okay, so moving on now to the second part of the talk, which is about eye tracking and about attention. So, for those of you who haven't come from psychology backgrounds and haven't worked with eye tracking, you might not be hugely familiar with the idea of visual attention. But the main things to know about our visual attention is that it's limited. We can't pay attention to everything all at once. So that's what the change blindness demonstration at the beginning also showed us, is that we can't pay attention to everything in the world. And as such, we move our attention around to get more information about things for further processing. Okay? So attention is often seen to be a bit like a spotlight. So the classic metaphor is that attention is like a spotlight. We move this spotlight around the world, and anything that falls within that spotlight, we process further. We give it more cognitive attention. The spotlight is just a metaphor, and some people disagree. Some people see it more like a zoom lens. So you can zoom in and focus your attention on one small area, get a lot of information about that, or you can cast your lens a bit wider and you can get diffuse information about a wider area of the visual scene. But the crucial fact is we have to move our attention around. And another important fact about attention is that there's two ways that our attention can be directed. So one of them is by things that happen in the environment. So if I suddenly kind of click my finger, that will automatically grab your attention. Or if something in your peripheral vision suddenly starts to waggle, you detect that movement and your attention will be grabbed by it. Okay. And we call that bottom-up. It's when things in the environment are directing our attention, and sometimes also called exogenous attention. And if you allow people to just scan through an image and they've got no goal or no particular preconceptions in mind, their attention will be guided by what's salient in that image. So if we give someone a website, for instance, and with no particular tasks, their attention might be drawn more to those kind of visually interesting parts of the scene where there's a lot of colour, a lot of detail. So the sort of things that grab our attention externally are things that are very bright, things that move, things that are different from other things in their background. So if you were in a supermarket and someone put a red wine bottle in the middle of the green wine bottles, our attention would be grabbed by that red wine bottle. The other type of attention is when we decide where we want to pay attention to. So if we're given a particular task and we have a goal in mind, our attention will be allocated in order to achieve that task. And we call that top-down. So if someone is given a goal to look for the frequently asked questions, then their eye movements will be driven by where they expect the frequently asked questions to be, as you can see in this scan path here, which they continue going until they find them there at the bottom. Okay. So there's also basic facts about our visual system. So when we discuss our visual system, when we discuss the visual world, we talk about the degree of visual angle that we can see. So if you hold your arms out either side, then that's 180 degrees of visual angle there. We only actually get detailed information due to the structure of our eye. We only get detailed information from the central 2 degrees, so quite a narrow band in our whole visual world. And that's called our foveal vision, and that's to do with the type of photoreceptors that are found in the centre of our vision, which are called cones, and cones are the ones that encode detailed information. We can get some more information from the visual world, but it's not as detailed, so we can still detect sort of movement and gross colours from all the way out into our periphery, and that's quite useful because if there's some kind of like predator threatening us, we want to be able to attend to it really, really quickly. But if we want to get detailed information, then we have to move our eyes to bring things into our foveal vision. And then the type of eye movements there are more types of eye movements than this, but the type of eye movements that are relevant to us psychologically and to UX researchers are fixations and saccades, and to a lesser extent pursuit eye movements. So fixations are when the eye is still, and that's the time that we're actually taking in information from what we're looking at. And saccadic eye movements are kind of jumpy eye movements that we make between fixations. Sometimes when you tell people they make jumpy eye movements, it's a surprise to them. Some people are aware that their eye movements are jumpy. I don't know about you, but when you're reading, your eyes jump across the page, they don't move in a smooth way. If you make smooth pursuit eye movements, it's because you've got something to track. And that's the only way you can make smooth pursuit eye movements. If there's not something moving in a smooth way across your visual scene, it's impossible for you to make a smooth movement just looking at nothing. So your eyes will automatically move in this kind of jumpy way. Now, because we need to move our eyes to bring things into focus, that allows us to make an assumption that what we're looking at is actually what we're paying attention to and what we're thinking about. And that's called the I-mind assumption. So the assumption is that where we're paying attention to, or if we see where someone's paying attention to, we can tell what it is they're currently thinking about and what they're working on. Okay? There's two parts of this assumption, and that's that gaze position indicates where their attention is focused, and that the duration of the gaze indicates how difficult that activity is, or how difficult the processing is. So to demonstrate the difficulty, here's two more scan paths. This is the same passage of text, written in English, and this person reading it has English as a first language, and this person reading it has English as a second language. So you can almost feel the kind of labour involved in reading this line of text. The fixations are longer, as indicated by the larger circles, and there's lots of what we call regressions. So the eye moves across the line of text and then frequently has to move back to check on things. Okay. So eye movements can indicate difficulty, and the duration with which we stare at something also varies according to the task we're doing and what it is we're looking at. So when we're reading, average fixation duration is about 225 milliseconds. When we're searching for something, average fixation duration is about 275, and when we're perceiving a scene, average fixation is about 330 milliseconds. Okay. So the I-mind assumption says that we can learn a lot about what cognitive processing is going on by looking at where people's eyes are. It is just an assumption, and there's conditions under which it's not a valid assumption. So we can actually pay attention to something that we're not looking at. It's not easy, but you can. If you look at something, I don't know, if you look at the Salford University logo and don't take your eyes off it, you can still pay attention to something over here. So you can dissociate the focus of your attention from where your gaze is pointing. But it's difficult, and we don't do it really when we've got kind of a task to do. If we're allowed to move our eyes, then we generally will. So that's why eye tracking is a really good way of looking at where people are paying attention. So eye tracking's been around now for over 100 years. But the early eye trackers used to be really nasty and invasive. So they would involve mounting a device actually on the pupil itself, usually with a little hole cut out so people could see through it, and then that device would be connected to something which would record when the eyes were moving. Modern eye trackers aren't invasive like that, which means that they're really useful for us doing our research, and they tend to use two sources of information. When we shine light into an eye, it creates a reflection or a glint, and that's called the corneal reflection. And what you'll notice is that as this eye is moving around, the corneal reflection is staying in the same place, but the pupil is moving. So if we know the relative positions of the pupil and the corneal reflection, we can understand where the eye is pointing. So modern eye trackers work on this basis, and what they do is shine a light into the eye, infrared light, and measure the reflection of that infrared light, and also locate the position of the pupil. Okay? And so a video camera will pick up these sources of information and use that information to encode where the eye is pointing. Another part of the puzzle is the calibration screen. So a calibration image will be shown to the participant at the start of the session, and we'll ask the participant to fixate and sequence different regions of the screen. Usually it's the middle and the corners, and then sometimes also kind of the middle at the sides as well. And basically what that allows us to do is to see what the relative position of these pieces of information is when the eye is looking at different regions of space. So once we know that, we take away the calibration image, give the participant the stimuli that we want to eye track, and then we can infer where they're looking, so we know what their eye looks like in all these different places of the visual world. So there's various different types of eye tracker available. These are both desk-mounted eye trackers, and we call them remote eye trackers because the participant isn't actually joined to them. And This was our old eye tracker, and this was the eye tracker that we used for the CBeebies project. And you can see we have a child there using a lovely child-friendly keyboard, engaging with some CBeebies stimuli. We don't have that eye tracker anymore, but we've upgraded to this one. This was brilliant, really good eye tracker. This is even better. The camera here is integrated actually into the monitor. The whole thing's much slicker, and it's so easy to set up. We let our undergrad students loose on this. We usually just give them one training session on how to use it, and they're good to go, and they collect really good data. They're really good, and they allow head movement. Okay, so you don't have to keep completely rigidly still. When I first started eye tracking, when I was doing my PhD at Nottingham, we used to put people in chin rests and sometimes with bike guards as well. And because they're psychology experiments, they'd be like an hour long, so they'd just like dribble down their face. We don't need to do that anymore. We wouldn't have been able to do that with children either. But what we did find with children, not so much with adults, is that when something got really, really exciting, they were off the chair, climbing into the screen. And obviously, when they're not in front of the eye tracker, that loses their eye tracking recording. But we thought actually that's not really that detrimental to our study, because what we're getting there is data about what's got them really, really excited and really thrilled. But what that drummed home is that we needed to record that as well. We needed to record what they were doing. It wasn't enough just to get the eye tracking. This is another eye tracker, another remote eye tracker. We call this standalone because the eye tracker itself is down here. You can see it. It's just this thing here. And it can be attached to lots of different devices. So we only got this eye tracker last week, and the video I'm going to show you now is our first ever demo with it, so pretty impressive how quickly we've got really good data from it. This is our technician, Rob, being eye tracked on my iPad, and the way this works is the camera's there underneath, pointing up at Rob's eyes, and then there's a webcam mounted on a stand, pointing down, recording what's actually going on the screen. Well, there's a voiceover here and it's really cringy, but it's not supposed to be a proper user testing session, this is just us playing. I find that pretty exciting. I think it's pretty accurate on what essentially is quite a small device. And after we did this, we did an iPhone, and that was also accurate enough for us to tell quite easily what apps were being looked at. Accurate enough to see the typing, yeah.
What's the hardware using there to the eye camera?
I don't know what the webcam is, if that's what you mean. Do you mean the actual eye tracker?
Yeah.
It's a Tobii.
Oh, okay.
Tobii eye tracker, yeah. I think the model is perhaps called the X50. I'd have to ask my technician. I've become more and more distant from the actual kind of technical buying aspects of the eye trackers. Rob does that, but I think it's called the X50. Yeah. It can be used in lots of different configurations. So we've got this stand that allows us to quite quickly have the right configuration of where the camera's pointing, where the device is mounted, and where the eye tracker is. But you can play around with it. So I've seen studies whereby they've used the same eye tracker, but they've used it in an office environment, and they've placed a video camera behind the people in the office to record what's going on their screen. So the webcam can be positioned in a different place depending on what you want to record. Yeah. Okay. So these two types of eye trackers, usually as standard, give the software give certain types of data visualization. So these are the ones that seem to be quite popular when people are presenting eye tracking results. So I should point out that this is a single participant viewing Salford University homepage and visualised in 3 different ways. So this is a heat map of one participant. You don't normally present heat maps of one participant. You normally aggregate all your participants together to present heat maps, and I've got a really striking example of that on the next slide, so I won't talk too much about heat maps, other than to say, visually, they're really, really appealing, and you maybe get a better sense of what's going on when you look at heat maps, but you can't really conclude anything concrete from them, you can't do any kind of quantitative analysis. Scan paths are more useful, and you might pick certain aspects of a scan path, such as whether somebody looked at something that you're particularly interested in, like a link or an area of the screen, and then moved on before going back to it. So that type of behaviour can be really, really useful. But again, the scan paths alone are more as a visualisation tool and not the sort of thing you can do kind of rigorous quantitative analysis on. And the third is a video, but I don't think you need to play that. It's pretty much the same as the videos I've already played. So this is, again, another undergraduate study. This is in media psychology rather than being a concern of UX. But one question that media psychologists have worried about for a long time is the effect of viewing beautiful people and what that does on our self-esteem. But most of the research has been done with women. And this undergraduate student, Zoe, was interested in how men, straight men, view other men's bodies. So she assembled these images of hunky models and celebrities, and then I tracked 20 guys after giving them a self-esteem test. And these are the heat maps of all the participants. So there's certain features of where they're looking that are quite consistent and quite striking. And what she found actually is that the men with higher self-esteem spend more time looking at the face, and the men with lower self-esteem spend more time looking at the body. That has nothing to do, you probably won't ever be engaged in a study like that, but I thought it's a really nice demonstration of heat maps. To do a really in-depth analysis, you need to get at the numerical data files, and there's 2 types of files. The first is the samples file. So the eye tracker that we recorded this from sampled the position of the eye every 20 milliseconds. And so in the samples file, you'll get the timestamp, and you'll see that's increasing to 20 milliseconds. And then the gaze point coordinates. So you get 2 coordinates, x and y. 0, 0 is always the top left of the screen. And then depending on what your screen resolution is, the bottom right of the screen will be something like 1024 by 768. So you can tell where gaze is basically using these samples. And these samples files are enormous, so not particularly amenable to doing an analysis unless you want to kind of program your own algorithms to get interesting information out of them. What you would normally do, and most eye tracking software will do this for you, is have a fixation file. And what the fixation file does is take the samples and work out which of them belong together in a fixation. Okay, so usually they'll have an algorithm built in, and the algorithm will look something like this. So this algorithm is saying that consecutive samples, so from these files, if they're within 30 pixel radius of each other, then they can be classed together as a fixation. But only if the sum of those samples is more than 100 milliseconds. So if the eye is within 30 pixel radius for more than 100 milliseconds, we'll group them together and we'll call that a fixation. And then the fixation file gives us this information. So it gives us duration information there, the coordinate, x coordinate there, and the y coordinate there, so we know where the eye was looking. So we can use that information then to numerically answer questions like, how quickly did someone look at a particular part of the screen, and how long were they engaged with looking at that part of the screen? And the final aspect is setting areas of interest. So areas of interest are things that we go into the study wanting to know about. Okay? So say I wanted to know whether people looked at the Salford University logo, at our VC's blog, or at the library link. These are my areas of interest, and then most eye tracking software will allow you to pre-specify those areas of interest and then record them in your fixation file. So it will say here which fixations corresponded or fell within those areas. So then you can do a really quick kind of extract of how long people looked at those areas, how long it took them to look at those areas. Okay, the third type of eye tracker are head-mounted eye trackers, which are for recording people doing mobile activities. So, for instance, the first time I came across one of these was the driving research that I was involved in. And then since I've been at Salford, I've been working with people who are amputees fitted with prosthetic limbs. And the research aim is to understand how they use vision to guide their movements with prosthetic devices. So this is the eye tracker here. You can't really see it too well. It's mounted, it's from SMI, and it's mounted on a helmet. And it also has a source of light that's bounced up into the eye with a mirror. But where it differs from the other eye trackers is that there's a scene camera that's attached to the front of the helmet that basically moves as you move and records what's in front of you. And so what you do with the calibration at the beginning of those sessions is let the eye tracker know what your eye looks like at different parts of that image that's captured by the scene camera. This video is actually of an intact subject, so not an amputee, fitted with a prosthetic device over the top of an intact arm. We're getting them to do a simple reaching task. So this eye tracker we've had for a number of years now. It's served us really well, but we're now in the market. You've probably seen the goggles or the glasses that are much easier to use, much nicer for the participants involved. This helmet is actually connected by, I think, 3 quite heavy cables to a little laptop. And the idea is that you can wear the laptop in a rucksack so that the participant can actually move around with the computer in the rucksack on their back. But actually the cables are so heavy that it pulls the helmet back off their head. So you have to do it up really, really tight. So seated, as this participant is not too much of a problem, but moving around with the helmet, we found that to be quite awkward. But we should be getting some goggles quite soon, so that's pretty exciting for us. Okay, so this person here, Aga, I'm going to say Boyko, I think that's the correct way to pronounce her name, has written a really fantastic book, which I wish I'd written, and I've got it on the slide at the end, but it's basically eye tracking the user experience, so how to do eye tracking in UX. And if you're asking yourself whether eye tracking is the right thing to do in your studies, she's produced this kind of handy flowchart of questions to identify whether eye tracking for you is the right approach. So first of all, the first question you should ask yourself is, will the eye tracking produce actionable insights? Okay. And the important distinction here is eye tracking for the sake of just wanting to know more about where people are looking. And if you do eye track, undoubtedly you probably will learn more about where people are looking. Versus eye tracking when you've got a specific problem in mind and the eye tracking can give you a solution to that problem. So the clearest problem is if you have some kind of product or some kind of website and people aren't clicking on a particular link. And you want to know why people aren't clicking on that link. Is it because they're not finding it? Or is it because they're finding it and they don't understand what it's for? So eye tracking data can give you a really easy answer to that particular problem. Okay? So if they never fixate on it, it's because they don't find it. If they fixate on it and move off, it's because they haven't understood that's what they need to do to complete their task. So that's an actionable insight, which is different from just eye tracking in order to understand general patterns, for instance, of how people use websites. So if the answer to that is no, she suggests don't think about eye tracking. If the answer is yes, you might then want to ask yourself, if there's a simpler way of answering the same question. Okay, so would another method give you a more immediate answer? And the reason that that's worth asking is because eye tracking studies, although they are so much easier than they used to be even just 10 years ago, there's still quite a few things you need to consider when setting them up. The data can be quite rich, so there's quite a lot to do with analysis of eye tracking data, and it is much easier to plug someone in front of a computer and just get them to talk through their experiences. So there is a cost attached to eye tracking, so you want to ask yourself if it's the simplest method. But I think what's important to bear in mind answering that question is the fact that people are really, really poor at reporting what they've looked at, and really poor at remembering where they were gazing and how they allocated their attention across images. And if it's really people's attention you're interested in, I think eye tracking is going to be the solution to that problem. There's nothing better than that at the moment. And the third question is, even if eye tracking might not be the simplest method, might it give you a buy-in boost? So might it be persuasive? Might there be stakeholders that you need to persuade about a particular design or project that doing some eye tracking data will add that persuasive edge to your case? So even if there might be a simpler method, perhaps eye tracking will really drum home a particular need. Okay. So some practical considerations. This is a good eye, this is what we want. This is where the eye tracker is failing to capture what's going on. So one of the practical considerations is the actual people that you're testing. And there's certain things that aren't conducive to getting a good image of the eye. So one of them are eyelashes that point down in front of people's eyes. Can be quite detrimental. We used to actually at Nottingham curl people's eyelashes out the way, and everyone was amenable to it as well, so that was good. But other things like heavy makeup can sometimes get in the way, because if the eye tracker is trying to locate the pupil, it can get confused by heavy eyelashes. Okay. Thick glasses can sometimes be an issue, not so much for our remote eye trackers that are desk-based. We've not found them to struggle with any kind of glasses. But this is an image from the head-mounted eye tracker, and that has real difficulty with glasses. And another practical consideration is tiredness. So as your eyes become tired and they become kind of heavy-lidded, that can be a problem for eye tracking. So when I did a study with older adults, we collected masses of data from them over a 3-hour session, and eye tracking was the very last study that we did. And by that point, they were frazzled. And so a lot of them we just failed to eye track. But even taking all those things into consideration, there is the chance that you might struggle to get good data sets from all your participants. So the recommendation is to always schedule a few more than you actually need to replace missing data. And the other practical considerations relate to the lab space itself where you do the eye tracking. So some eye trackers will have a controller monitor as well, so this is the facilitator there. And sometimes the eye is presented on this screen as well, so that the facilitator can check that the eye is getting a good reading from the eye. But if the participant can see what's going on that monitor, then that's really distracting. So angle it out the way so they can't see what you're doing. And also have a nice kind of blank space, so there's not lots of competing things in the environment for your attention. And then the other thing I think that's really important is the chair. We really learned this with the CBeebies children, wriggling around, swinging from side to side with the chair. The ideal chair is something that you can raise up and down, and the reason for that is that it's easier to adjust the height of the participant than it is to tinker around with the angle of the camera. So if you've got a chair that goes up and down, that's really useful. But also if you've got one that doesn't have wheels, so it doesn't move back and forth, or doesn't rotate from side to side, that's also really useful. We stopped using chin rests ages ago. We've not really found that they're that important. Okay, finally, what I think is really, really important is not relying on eye tracking as your single source of information. Because if you recall that really complex table that I put up a few slides ago, There's lots of different aspects of the user experience we can record. Lots of different levels of engagement, types of experience like cognitive, emotional, behaviour, attention, and we can do this during or after. There's no single method that allows us really good insight to everything. So I would always triangulate with eye tracking. Retrospective think aloud is a really useful way of getting more insight. So what you do here is you play the scan path back to the participant afterwards. You can do it in slow motion and you can do it piece by piece, and you ask the participants to tell you what they were doing at that particular time. And they can use that scan path as a memory aid. If you just ask them without that scan path, they would struggle to remember, but they can use their gaze replay as a memory aid. And I think observation, body language, facial expression, and you can get good software now that records facial expressions, alongside can help you validate some of what you get with eye tracking. Because one thing that's assumed is that the longer you look at something, the more processing that's involved. But of course, it might be that something's aesthetically pleasing, so you're looking at it because you quite like it. Or it might be that you have a lapse of concentration, or it might be that something's really irritating. So the same eye tracking data might indicate different types of experience, and other methods can help you disambiguate that. So, take-home points. First thing to ask yourself is, will eye tracking actually really achieve your study objectives? If it's not going to, and you just want it to get a kind of general insight into where people are looking, you're going to be faced with masses of data that will be difficult to wade through without any kind of specific questions to target your analysis. If the answer to that question is yes, then I would say the first thing you should always do is pilot. So all those practical considerations about the laboratory, there's often other stuff that you won't have thought of. The only way to really understand that is to pilot with a couple of your colleagues first. Even though they're your colleagues, they'll unearth anything about your setup that's not working very well. And also you get so much slicker with repeated testing, so practice on your colleagues and triangulate with other methods. Okay, and that's the end.